What happens when a desperate man asks Clint Eastwood for just $1? He never expected the legendary actor's response, one that would change his life forever. Stay tuned for this incredible story. The sun dipped low over San Francisco Bay, casting golden hues across the bustling city where towering skyscrapers met the silent despair of the forgotten. Tourists strolled along the waterfront, snapping photos of the Golden Gate Bridge, while business executives in tailored suits rushed between meetings, their lives untouched by the struggles hiding in the city's shadows. On the quieter side of town, tucked between a weathered bookstore and a neon-lit dive bar, stood Benny's Diner, a relic of the 1950s, known for its strong coffee, greasy burgers, and the kind of nostalgia that never quite faded. Seated in a dimly lit corner booth, sipping his coffee in silence, was Clint Eastwood, a man whose name carried the weight of legend. Despite his fame, he sought no attention, preferring solitude over the empty praise of admirers. Across the street, Nate Walker, a once proud Navy aircraft mechanic, stood against a graffiti-stained brick wall, clutching the frayed edges of his military-issued jacket. His boots, once polished to perfection, were now worn thin, and his calloused hands trembled from days without food. Pride had kept him from begging, but hunger had no mercy. His stomach twisted painfully as he watched waitresses glide through the diner, balancing plates of hot food. Taking a slow, measured breath, he forced himself forward, stepping off the curb, one foot in front of the other, toward the last person he ever expected to meet, Clint Eastwood. The bell above the diner's door jingled as Nate stepped inside, his presence drawing a few sideways glances from nearby customers. The warmth of the room hit him instantly, a stark contrast to the bone-chilling wind outside. The scent of freshly brewed coffee and sizzling bacon filled the air, making his stomach clench painfully. He hesitated, his boots scuffing against the black and white checkered floor, unsure if he should turn back before anyone noticed him. But then he saw Clint Eastwood, seated alone, casually stirring his coffee, his sharp eyes hidden behind dark aviator sunglasses. Nate swallowed hard, his throat dry, and forced himself to move forward. Reaching the booth, he cleared his throat, his voice barely above a whisper. "Sir, could you spare $1?" The words tasted like rust in his mouth. For a moment, there was silence, a heavy, suffocating pause. A few nearby diners glanced up, some with curiosity, others with quiet disdain. The waitress behind the counter stopped mid-pour, her eyes flickering between the two men. Clint slowly lifted his head, removing his sunglasses, revealing a gaze as piercing as ever. His expression was unreadable, neither cold nor inviting. But his silence held weight. Nate braced himself for rejection, for indifference, for the kind of dismissal he'd grown used to. Then Clint leaned back slightly, tilting his head as if studying Nate, as if trying to piece together the life behind the worn jacket, the weathered face, and the quiet desperation in his voice. Instead of reaching for his wallet, he did something unexpected. He gestured to the empty seat across from him. "Sit down," Clint said, his voice low. "Steady, let's talk." Nate hesitated, his instincts telling him to walk away. No one ever wanted to talk. They wanted him gone. Yet there was something in Clint's voice, something firm but not unkind, that made him pause. Slowly he slid into the booth, his fingers tightening around the frayed cuffs of his jacket as if bracing for an interrogation. The diner, though still buzzing with quiet conversations and the clinking of silverware, felt smaller, like all eyes were on him. Across the table, Clint took a slow sip of his coffee, studying Nate with the same intensity he once reserved for villains in old westerns. The silence stretched, thick with unspoken questions. Nate swallowed hard, forcing himself to speak. I don't usually ask for money," he muttered, his voice rough, his gaze flickering downward. "Just ran out of options." Clint didn't interrupt. He didn't nod in false sympathy or offer meaningless words of encouragement. Instead, he let Nate talk, something no one had done in years. The words spilled out, hesitant at first, then unstoppable. "I used to work on fighter jets. Spent years in the Navy, good at it too," Nate admitted, a ghost of pride slipping into his voice before it faded just as quickly. "But things changed, got home, and the world moved on without me. Lost my job, lost my place, lost myself somewhere along the way." His fingers curled into fists on the table. "Now I just take it a day at a time." Clint exhaled slowly, setting his coffee cup down. His expression didn't shift, didn't pity. Instead he asked, "So, tell me, what's the next chapter of your story?" Nate blinked, caught off guard. "The next chapter?" He scoffed bitterly. "Man, I'm just trying to make it through the night. Clint leaned forward, elbows resting on the table. That's not a chapter, Nate. That's a sentence. You need a real chapter, something to fight for. The words hit harder than Nate expected, cutting through the years of exhaustion, doubt, and self-pity. For the first time in a long while, someone wasn't looking at him like he was already lost. Nate let out a dry chuckle, shaking his head. You don't get it, he muttered, rubbing his calloused hands together as if trying to erase the years of struggle written into his skin. Some people don't get chapters. Some of us just fade out before the story even ends. He glanced toward the window, watching a group of well-dressed executives step out of a sleek black car, their laughter cutting through the night like a reminder of everything he had lost. Guys like me, we don't get second chances. Clint didn't flinch. Instead, he leaned forward, his eyes locked onto Nate's, unwavering. That's the biggest lie I've ever heard. His voice was calm, deliberate, as if he had seen this story play out before and already knew the ending. You think you're the only one who's been knocked down? The only one who's lost everything? His fingers tapped against the ceramic coffee mug, his thoughts momentarily drifting. I grew up in the middle of the Great Depression. You know what that was like? Nate hesitated, unsure if Clint was just another rich guy trying to sound humble. Can't imagine you ever starving, he muttered. Clint nodded slowly. Well, I did. I remember my folks splitting a single can of beans for dinner, stretching it for a family of 4. I remember sleeping in cheap motels, wondering if we'd be on the street the next day. I remember watching my parents keep their heads up, even when the world tried to break them. His voice darkened, a rare glimpse of the past woven into his words. You know what I learned? Nobody's coming to save you. You either get up or you get left behind. Nate looked down, his throat tightening. For years, people had offered him pity, but Clint was offering him something else. Accountability, belief, a challenge. Then Clint reached into his pocket, but not for money. Instead, he slid a business card across the table. Go here, he said firmly. They'll help, but you have to take the first step. For the first time in years, Nate hesitated, because he finally had a choice. Nate sat in stunned silence, Clint's words lingering in the air like a challenge he wasn't sure he was ready to accept. A real chapter? He wanted to scoff, to shake his head, to tell Clint he didn't get it, how the world chewed people up and spat them out, how once you fell far enough, there was no climbing back. But something in the actor's steady gaze made him pause. This wasn't some empty pep talk. There was conviction behind those words, as if Clint had seen his own share of hardship, as if he knew exactly what it felt like to be knocked down and forced to get back up. Clint reached into his jacket, and for a moment, Nate expected him to pull out a crumpled bill, the way strangers sometimes did just to get rid of him faster. Instead, Clint slid a small, neatly printed business card across the table. Go here, he said, his voice calm but firm. It's a shelter run by a friend of mine. They'll help you get cleaned up, find work, maybe even a place to stay. But you have to take the first step. Nate stared at the card, his hands trembling as he picked it up. The name and address felt heavier than they should. A lifeline, one he wasn't sure he deserved. Why? The word slipped from his lips before he could stop it. His voice cracked, raw with something he couldn't quite name. Why are you doing this? For the first time that night, Clint's expression softened, just slightly. Because someone did it for me once, and I wouldn't be sitting here if they hadn't. Nate clenched his jaw, swallowing against the lump in his throat. Could he trust this? Could he trust himself? His fingers tightened around the card as if it might disappear. I don't know, man, he muttered. Places like that, they don't really help people like me. Clint didn't blink. Then prove yourself wrong. The words hit harder than Nate expected. For the first time in years, he had a choice. Nate sat frozen, the weight of the business card pressing against his palm like a challenge he wasn't sure he could face. For years, he had told himself that people like him didn't get second chances, that once you fell far enough, the world forgot you. But now, staring across the table at Clint Eastwood, a man who had no reason to care, Nate felt something unfamiliar, a flicker of possibility, a crack in the wall he had built around himself. He glanced toward the diner's window, watching cars blur past in the cold San Francisco night. He could walk out right now, toss the card in the gutter, and keep living the way he had been, one night at a time, one meal at a time, always waiting for the next inevitable failure. Or he could take a chance, but taking a chance meant admitting he wasn't beyond saving, and that terrified him. Clint stirred his coffee, waiting, not pushing. His patience made the silence louder. Finally, Nate exhaled sharply, his breath shaky. I'll think about it. It was the best he could give, the safest answer, but even saying it out loud felt like stepping toward something different. Clint nodded once, as if that was enough. Good, he said. That's all I'm asking. Nate stood slowly, his body aching from too many cold nights on the pavement. He looked at Clint, at the man who had just thrown him a lifeline without asking for anything in return. The words caught in his throat, but he forced them out anyway. Thanks for listening. Clint's lips curled in the faintest hint of a smile. Take care of yourself, Nate. As Nate stepped out into the night, he gripped the business card tightly. For the first time in years, he had something to hold on to. He didn't know if he would go to the shelter tomorrow or next week or ever, but for the first time in a long time, he wasn't completely sure of his own failure, and sometimes that was enough to change everything. Months passed and the cold grip of winter loosened as spring crept into San Francisco. The streets were the same. Tourists still flooded the waterfront. Businessmen still rushed to meetings, and the world still moved forward, indifferent to those left behind. But for Nate Walker, everything had changed. He had taken the first step. It wasn't easy. Walking through the doors of the shelter had felt like stepping into unfamiliar territory, a place where hope didn't seem to belong to men like him. But they hadn't turned him away. They had given him a meal, clean clothes, and more importantly, a chance. The shelter's director, a grizzled former Marine named Joe Martinez, had seen something in Nate, a fighter who just needed the right push. Within weeks, Nate had landed a temporary job at a warehouse loading dock, and by the third month, he was renting a small room in a shared apartment. One evening, after a long shift, Nate sat at his second-hand desk, staring at a blank sheet of paper. Clint Eastwood's business card lay beside it, edges worn from being handled too many times. Nate hadn't seen the man since that night in the diner, but not a day had passed without thinking about the conversation that had started it all. He picked up a pen. "Mr. Eastwood," he wrote, his handwriting unsteady but determined. "You probably don't remember me, but I'll never forget you. That night you told me I needed a new chapter. I didn't believe you. I thought my story was already over, but you were right. I took the first step and now I'm standing on my own again. I just wanted to say thank you." Weeks later, in a quiet study filled with film scripts and old photographs, Clint Eastwood unfolded the letter. He read it in silence, a small, knowing smile tugging at the corner of his lips. With careful hands, he placed the letter in a drawer with a few other keepsakes, reminders of moments that mattered. Because sometimes, the greatest roles we play aren't on the big screen, but in the lives we choose to impact. Life has a way of knocking you down when you least expect it. But the truth is, what happens next is always up to you. Nate Walker's story isn't just about homelessness. It's about the choices we make when we're at our lowest. We all face setbacks. Losing a job, dealing with heartbreak, struggling with self-doubt. But the difference between staying stuck and moving forward comes down to one thing: taking that first step. It doesn't have to be huge. It doesn't have to fix everything overnight, but it has to be something. Maybe it's asking for help, applying for that job, or finally believing you deserve better. And for those who are in a position to help, never underestimate the power of simply listening. Clint Eastwood didn't hand out cash, didn't offer empty sympathy. He saw Nate when no one else did. Sometimes, all it takes is one conversation, one act of kindness to change someone's life. So wherever you are today, whether you're the one struggling or the one in a place to help, remember, your story isn't over. The next chapter starts when you decide to turn the page. Make that choice.